Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This lecture is about brainstem. Brainstem is composed mainly of three parts, starting from the lowest one, which is the medulla oblongata, then pons, and then midbrain or mesencephalon. As you see from the strategic place of the brainstem, it's located between the brain and the spinal cord, which means any communication between the brain and the spinal cord, it has to pass through these structures. And this kind of communication can be in the form of ascending or sensory pathways and descending or motor pathways. So several ascending and descending tracts are present within these structures of the brainstem. In addition to the tracts, there are many nuclei spread over here in the brainstem. Of these nuclei are nuclei of most cranial nerves are present here in the brainstem, and to control different functions related to these specific cranial nerves, such as visual symptoms, auditory processing, maybe swallowing, or different kinds of function. In addition to these nuclei, there are many other nuclei related to different functions, such as the cardiovascular and respiratory center here, or other kind of reflexes present. Furthermore, there are here specialized structure extending all over the brainstem and a little bit below and above it. It's called the reticular formation, which is the main control of the consciousness level in our body. This is a section in the medulla oblongata, and you can see how many structures are present within this area of the brainstem. As we said before, it has many ascending and descending tracts or sensory and motor tracts, such as the spinothalamic tract, the corticospinal tract, or the pyramidal pathway, and you can see the specialized structure that's called the pyramids. That's why it's named the pyramidal tract. Also, there are many nuclei that can be either related to sensory function or the motor function, such as the gracile and cuneate nuclei present. Many also other nuclei or centers are relating to controlling the cardiovascular function and the respiratory function are located in this area. Therefore, any lesion or injury to the medulla oblongata is actually life-threatening. In addition, there are many centers for reflexes, such as the hiccuping reflex, the swallowing, the vomiting reflex, and many other reflexes. You can see here also the inferior olivary nucleus, that we will talk more about it with the cerebellum function. In addition to this kind of specialized structures that extend all through the brainstem, also to some parts of the diencephalon and the spinal cord, it's called the reticular formation. We will talk a bit more about it later on. We said also before that there will be many nuclei related to different cranial nerves at the level of the medulla. So this is a schematic representation of a section in the pons, and the pons is characterized that it's been kind of divided into two parts. The dorsal part, like this one, and the ventral part is this one. The dorsal part is just similar to what we said about the medulla. It contains different ascending and descending tracts. It also had different nuclei for cranial nerves. But the ventral part, it has this specialized structures all over the ventral parts. They are called pontine nuclei. These pontine nuclei are very important in connecting between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum in the movement kind of processing pathways that we will talk about in more details later. The most superior part of the brainstem is called the midbrain or mesencephalon. you can see here in a section of the midbrain that anteriorly it has this kind of specialized structure that's called cerebral peduncle. And remember that we said the corticospinal, corticobulbar axons, they pass through this cerebral peduncle structures. Anterior to it or posterior to it is the substantia nigra, and because it's kind of dark in color, that's why it's called nigra. And so substantia nigra, you remember that it's been an integral part of the basal nuclei. It's considered as part of the basal nuclei. The substantia nigra can be further divided into substantia nigra pars compacta and pars reticularis. Remember that we said that the pars compacta part of it is the one that releases dopaminergic neurons into the basal nuclei to further modulate the motor function, whereas the pars reticularis is more like an output nucleus, such as just similar to the globus pallidus internus. So it sends GABAergic neurons into the thalamus, to different nuclei in the thalamus. And remember that substantia nigra pars compacta is when it has a pathological condition with impaired dopamine release that will result in a disease called Parkinson. Retinucleus is again related to movement and will be discussed later in more detail. We have again reticular formation parts, different centers controlling visual and auditory reflexes, especially in the tectum. So the tectum concerns the superior colliculus related to visual reflexes, and there is also the inferior colliculus more related to the auditory reflexes. And one of these reflexes, what we call it the startle reflex. So that's when you hear a sudden loud noise, then that will result in certain movement in the head, the neck, and your body. Also here, this is the periaqueductal gray matter that we talked about it when we talked about pain and the endogenous analgesic system. It's located here. Again, the midbrain, as in every other structure in the brainstem, it contains different ascending and descending pathways and tracts, and also contains different nuclei for cranial nerves. Now we'll talk about this specialized structure of the brainstem that's called reticular formation. Actually, it's not contained only within the brainstem, but it kind of extends to the spinal cord and the diencephalon. This structure is not very well understood yet, but it's kind of a network between different neurons, and the cell bodies are not kind of clustered as a nuclei. That's why it's called reticular formation. And has so many ascending and descending tracts and functions related to it in their medial and lateral parts. One of these parts of the reticular formation is called the reticular activating system. That's the ascending pathway. And this reticular activating system, as you see, it will pass through the thalamus and even bypassing the thalamus to different areas in the cerebral cortex. They are responsible for this kind of consciousness. That's why this reticular activating system is considered as the switch on button of consciousness in our body. So this is the one that keeps you conscious and alert, attentive, so you will be able to concentrate on certain thought or certain object. It's kind of also help to prevent some sort of sensory overload. So you know, in our daily activities, we have so many sensory inputs that come at the same time, and sometimes you have to focus on one or some of these kind of sensory information. The one who decided which sensory information to focus on is the reticular formation or the reticular activating system. For example, if you now are looking at your phone and listening to the lecture, and smelling something, then your reticular activating system is the one to decide which one you're going to focus on at the moment. So preventing sensory overload. you can see that the reticular activating system is getting many sensory inputs, visual, auditory, and also somatosensory information. So these kind of things also, because we said it's a switch on button of consciousness, that's mean when this system is active, you are conscious and alert. If this system becomes inactive, you are either sleeping or maybe comatose. So while you are sleeping, in order to be awake, so you activate this system, you can either do this by certain sensory input. For example, a light on your eyes, or maybe a loud sound that will wake you up. Maybe some sort of somatic sensory inputs, such as pressure or even touch. But Box says that olfactory sensation have no input into this system. So smelling something will not wake you up. That's why some people will die of suffocation while they are sleeping. And so the other parts of the reticular formation can be also descending and control muscle tone and different functions related to movement. It's also related to controlling the heart rate, the respiratory rate, and different other functions. Now let's talk more about the motor functions of the brainstem. And when we talk about the motor function of the brainstem, it's very important to talk about the red nucleus, which is located in the midbrain. Red nucleus receives inputs from the primary motor cortex and the magnocellular part of the red nucleus, which has similar somatographic representation of the muscles that are present similarly in the motor cortex. And it also has this large neuronal cells situated there, similar to the beta cells in the motor cortex. And you remember that the distribution of the cells, there were dynamic versus static cells. And here also in the red nucleus, they are both the dynamic and the static neurons. However, the number of the dynamic neurons are larger, probably because of their integrated and close relationship with the cerebellum that's concerned with movement, and especially rapid movement. So this type of descending pathway is called the corticorubral tract, and then the information here will be integrated and also receive branches from the corticospinal tract. Then it will descend as a rubrospinal tract that is accompany the corticospinal tract, more specifically the lateral corticospinal tract. And so this corticorubrospinal tract serves as an accessory or a backup tract in case of there is any injury in the corticospinal tract. This tract will take over to maintain the movement. However, there will be still impairment in this finest kind of movements of the fingers. Both the corticospinal tract and the corticorubrospinal tract, they are called the lateral motor system to distinguish it from the medial motor system, that's the vestibular reticular spinal tract. Now let's move on to the reticular nuclei. Reticular nuclei are divided into pontine reticular nuclei and medullary reticular nuclei. Actually, these nuclei act antagonistically, in which the pontine reticular nuclei excite the anti-gravity muscles, whereas the medullary reticular nuclei inhibit the anti-gravity muscles. So these pontine reticular nuclei, they transmit excitatory signals through the pontine reticulospinal tract, which will go down the spinal cord and will terminate in the medial anterior motor neurons. And there it will excite the axial muscles, specifically muscles of the vertebral column and the extensor muscles of the limbs, to cause excitation in these muscles. Pontine reticular nuclei have a high degree of natural excitability. It also gets excitatory signals from the vestibular nuclei and deep nuclei of the cerebellum. So if it's not opposed by the medullary reticular system, there will be a powerful excitation, so much intense excitation of the anti-gravity muscles in the body. So it should be opposed by this medullary reticular system. The medullary reticular nuclei sends inhibitory signals to these anti-gravity muscles through the medullary reticulospinal tract in the lateral column of the spinal cord. This medullary reticular nuclei also receives input from the corticospinal and the cerebrospinal tract to activate this tract to counteract the effects of the pontine reticular nuclei. So together, the excitatory signals by the pontine reticular nuclei and the inhibitory signals from the medullary reticular nuclei, together they form a very controllable system to maintain an appropriate contraction and relaxation, or a degree of contraction in these axial muscles, the anti-gravity muscles, that is different according to different situation. It can be modulated to different needs in the body. So the vestibular nuclei work together with the pontine reticular nuclei to control the contraction of the anti-gravity muscle. The signals coming from the vestibular nuclei are excitatory and will be transmitted through the lateral and medial vestibulospinal tracts. This is very important in conjunction with the pontine reticular system. What is special about the excitation of the ventricular nuclei to the anti-gravity muscle? It's selective in action, in which it selectively controls these signals to the different anti-gravity muscles to maintain equilibrium, because it's a vestibular nuclei, so it works according to signals coming from the vestibular apparatus. So vestibular signals are sent through the vestibular nerves, mainly to the vestibular nuclei. They can also go directly to the reticular nuclei, to the cerebellar, fastigial, and folliculonodular lobe nuclei. Now, these fibers that end in the vestibular nuclei, they will also send fibers to the cerebellum, the brainstem, the reticular nuclei, and down through the vestibulospinal tracts. The folliculonodular lobes of the cerebellum are especially concerned with the dynamic part of the equilibrium signals that's coming from the semicircular ducts. That's why an injury or a lesion in these lobes or in the semicircular duct, it will cause loss of the dynamic equilibrium, especially in rapid changes in the direction of movement. Vestibular signals also transmit upward to the cerebral cortex and also through the medial longitudinal fasciculus to the eye, so it can coordinate the eye movements with head rotations and keep the eye fixed at specific visual objects. That's it for now. Thank you.